Alyn, you've also written a memoir quite extensively. Do you think that's an extension of the novel form, an innovation of the novel form?
Yeah, of course it is to some extent, because you're doing... I do two things. I do oral histories, which involves actually becoming somebody else on the page to a certain extent, and that's almost like writing novels. I'm addressing that problem at the moment with the memoirs of a fairly eminent British band leader. And the process, the revision process, this question of applying the critical training is exactly the same, whether one's writing biography or whether one's writing somebody else's life. And I've got a very rigid procedure, and it's not quite like the people who get up and look at the desk for 3 hours and hope inspiration strikes, but I always try and write between 3 and 5 pages of finished text a day. At the end of that day, I put it away. The next morning, I read it critically, usually throw most of it away and start again. But the onward process is at the end of each day, there's between 1,500 and 2,000 words written, and that's the only way I can ever write a 150,000 word book. That's exactly the same process, whether it's a semi-fictional account of somebody else's life, or whether it's a researched academic biography. It's just that the way that one applies the faculty is slightly different. And this business of sharing, and the whole reason I'm a ghostwriter for other people, is that they don't feel empowered to write their story. They might be a pianist or in various cases band leader or whatever. I've done a lot of work with African Americans who had limited educational opportunities. Although I have to say the most challenging of all the books I did, which is at the back of the room there, was the autobiography of Danny Barker, who was a highly educated African American from New Orleans, but who didn't have any confidence in his abilities as a writer. He had been picked up by literary magazines in the 60s, and so there were set pieces which in some ways are as good as work by Faulkner or any of the other Southern writers, but A, he was a black Southern writer, and B, he'd been discouraged by the fact that people said, well, you're a musician, you can't be a writer. So then the challenge was to link some pieces that had been developed over a hugely long time. Some pieces he'd started writing in the 40s, and we met in 1986. So 40 years worth of discarded drafts. And actually, if you're interested, you can go and see this in the archive at Tulane. The William Ransom Hogan Archive Library there has all the drafts of some of the stories that we published together. And those stories often are black folklore. So the same stories turn up in the J.R.R. Morton Library of Congress recordings, they turn up in Louis Armstrong's autobiography, and they turn up in countless oral histories at Rutgers or Tulane or around the world. So my job with Danny was to, A, write something that was his voice, not mine. And that's pretty difficult if you come from the southeast of England and are educated here, and you're working with somebody who grew up in the ghetto in New Orleans. But, interestingly, and I've written a paper on this which I showed with Lucy the other day, trying to find that voice was probably easier for me being British than it would have been if I'd been a white American, and particularly a white Southern American. Mm-hmm. He was able to share things with me using an explanatory register, which actually worked very well for his readers, that he wouldn't have needed to do with an American audience because he would have assumed a lot of social mores about that, and so they simply would have been not issues that came up. And so the process with him was one of trying to match, in the bits that we wrote from scratch, the very finely wrought register of what he'd been writing over 40 years. Certainly the most interesting case of doing it. And the second most interesting, when I'll shut up, was George Shearing's memoirs. And George Shearing, as you may know, Britain's most significant jazz export to the States. He used to live in Stowe in the World, and I used to go and see George every summer, and we would work on his memoirs in between listening to the Test match on Radio 4. Because he didn't watch cricket on television because he couldn't see it. When he finished the first draft of the book, I gave it to somebody to read, another publishing friend, who said, "There aren't any adjectives in this." Because if your worldview is that of a blind person, you don't use the same adjectival register that we do. And so I had to go to George and say, "I'm awfully sorry, George, it's a rather dull read." "Why is that?" "Why is it? There's just no real description in it." So, what smells do, taste, touch. And so the book was a really interesting exercise in trying to extract a different adjectival register. That's nothing to do with the question.
Interesting. So, Jenny Lewis, your question.
A leading poet posted on Facebook last week that she was annoyed that people took her creative writing exercises and used them for their own classes. This relates to the whole issue of stealing versus borrowing, or homage, recently highlighted by the case of the London poet who stole Helen Mort's wonderful poem The Deer and won a prize with it himself. In this postmodern age, what does the panel feel about textual intellectual ownership? Is anything in the public realm fair game, or should poets and writers acknowledge sources and influences where and when they can?
So, would you like to address this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a neo-Luddite. Unlike Emma, I'm afraid I'm rather worried about the digital future, most chiefly because of the question of eating that you raised, Karina. Yes, the digital future is very exciting. We can all cross-reference each other's work, make connections, etc., broadcast ourselves to the world. But the problem is, well, A, who is actually listening, and B, how does one live? So I am worried about that. The question of ownership, I'm also very old-fashioned on that point, because I'm very unfunky on the question of copyright. I think that copyright is really important because that is how one is paid. There's a lot of sort of revolutionary rhetoric surrounding the internet in terms of sharing, you're not doing this for the money, you're doing it for the love of it, for the creativity and so on. But I think that sort of cuddly rhetoric disguises the fact that in the future, when writers and artists and musicians aren't paid for their work, then creativity and the body of written and creative work that we have as a civilization is going to suffer. So I think that ownership is really important. Can I also just say a couple of words on the two previous questions?
Sure.
One, the very rich question about the link between thought and writing. I mean, I can't do justice to that question, but I just wanted to say something about the spoken voice. And for me, something that I've been talking about with Lucy on email, the spoken voice is very important to me as a writer, and this is slightly different from actual spoken voice. So if I was to write down a transcript of my spoken voice, it would be awful, unpublishable. But somehow when I'm writing, I read what I've written aloud. I'm trained as a radio producer, and that's what I'm also trained to do when I write radio scripts. And I sort of see if it kind of scans as spoken language. And I think that's very important in terms of cementing the link between the real thought and the writing, because I think that making your writing like the spoken voice, or as a sort of written version of the spoken, gives it a life that helps to transmit the idea onto the page and then back again to the reader. So that helps to shorten that transition time, if you like, between the writing and the reading, or to make the link stronger between the writer and the reader. And also, just very briefly, the point about academia, because I did a PhD and then left that behind. I started a job at the BBC as a radio producer immediately afterwards, which I'm still at the BBC, although I write as well. So I made the transition from academia to journalism, and it was slightly disorientating because my PhD was about how Christians, denominations in the 16th and 17th centuries made use of Jewish ideas in very sort of involved internecine debates between Puritans and Anglicans and Catholics and so on. My book that I've written is about why Starbucks writes your name on your cup of latte when you pick it up at the counter. So this was a bit of a leap, but I did at some point realise that there is a strong link between these things, which is about identifying the agendas that I was talking about at the beginning, trying to to identify agendas that are writing or phenomena that are presented as neutral, as common sense, as self-evident, but that actually contain a concealed tendentiousness. And you get that in the debates over the date of Easter in 1649, but also in why they write your name on your coffee cup.
If indeed you give them your real name, which
Exactly.
I think is a mistake. Okay, thank you.
Can I just butt in on ownership?
Sure.
I think Jenny's question is probably the most significant question about the future of writing and writing as a commercial enterprise in this whole session. We are, as a group, under threat from the complete disregard of copyright by three people: Amazon, Microsoft and Apple. The entire e-book world, 89.5% of it, is controlled by those three entities, particularly since Microsoft bought Nook from Barnes & Noble. As an author of a book, when a copy of that book is sold, even to Amazon, they have to account for it. When an e-book is sold, the only people who can tell you whether they've made a further transaction to a member of the public or not is Amazon or Apple or Microsoft. There is a big campaign going on in the States amongst authors in the wake of the antitrust action against Google for scanning in thousands of copyright works without permission of publishers or authors. If you didn't object, it got done. And now that action is in its 7th year in the courts with no resolution. Apple are pretty fair because iTunes had to be done with the cooperation of the recording industry. And as far as their e-books go, they're probably the fairest of the lot. But Amazon are ripping off authors on a gross scale. Because who knows how many copies of a Kindle book have been sold? Only them. And no publisher, at this point, is brave enough to stand up to the loss of hard copies through Amazon to say, we want to challenge your figures and we want to open your books. The biggest piracy of intellectual copyright going on in this country and worldwide at the moment is through those e-book publishers. And the Publishers Association is slowly waking up to it. But they're not taking the right sort of action. Neither of the large publishers, who are still concerned with contract issues like the British publishers' traditional market and whether we pay list price royalties on books in the UK, can't even define the cost of a remainder because that's ceased with short-run reprints to be important. The publishing industry is selling its authors short, and only authors will make any difference to this. So if you take one thing away from today, it's fight those bastards at Amazon for everything they're worth.
We all have the example of the music industry where the dollar value of a song is now zero. There's no way you can make money from selling single songs, and I think that has sent shockwaves through the film industry, where I work certainly, and into publishing, because it's so difficult to protect your copyright. I think we've actually jumped to the question from Caroline. Alyn effectively answered it, the views on e-publication. Caroline, would you like to ask your question?
This one was much more about quality and value, and how do you sort of locate essentially good writing in a sort of modern world where there's so publishing is now so prolific, and as I said earlier, you've got blogs and then you've got Twitter, but then also you've got a lot of e-publishing, so you can get, at least if you have a sort of editor or a middle stage where you've got to go to publishing to get the book published, then there's an element of review, and if you look at the successes of some of the sort of e-authors who have self-published and went particularly well, that doesn't necessarily ascribe value to that writing. And how do we locate value? By value and quality, not monetary value.
I mean, Ted, you're an editor. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, and it's central to everything that we're doing, everything I do in my job on a daily basis. I think. If you have a series of individuals, I suppose, who become what you might call pure readers. In the publishing world, that term has become attached to some people. There's a blogger his name is John Self, and he has a knack, or he has an ability to read without bias, and that's actually sounds like an easy thing to do, but he's a very clear reader, and it's never he's not fawning, and he's not actually typically a book reviewer. He began as a blogger, and he can create an enormous amount of groundswell for a book. There's a book called Hawthorne and Child by Keith Ridgway, which is a fantastic kind of slightly neglected novel. It was sort of slightly knocked off the Booker long list, but Peter Stoddard, who's the judge of the Booker Prize, then later said that he really wished it had been on the shortlist. And that book had a massive sort of Twitter frisson. There was this great kind of groundswell of affection and interest in that book, partly because of John's writing on it. So it came directly from his enthusiasm and the respect that he commands as an independent viewer. And he occasionally writes for The Guardian. He's known as a sort of a book person that one can trust, I suppose. And I think that's really the key point. Not to sort of not for this to be marketing for granted, but we have a series that's New Voices, and the magazine has a certain seriousness, and often we feature writers who you'll be very familiar with, and it's not always the case that we're able to feature writers as many writers as we would like to, who are less well known. And New Voices is a fantastic platform, which I would encourage you all to apply for if you're writing fiction or non-fiction. And what that does is it basically gives a showcase to people who are just starting out in their careers and we really think are going to be very exciting. That heading, I think that by attaching it to the magazine, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Granta, it could be Paris Review or the New Yorker or whatever, those kinds of very trusted, there are other very trusted online centres where I hope, the credit of their editorial team is basically that they're not going to waste your time. They're going to send you to someone that's worth your time, and so those are the main sort of arbiters, I suppose, of some kind of taste. And then just outside of that, you've got a very interesting new phenomenon, which are basically sifters. So sites like Longreads, which is a really interesting site that basically acts as a sort of gigantic, hypersensitive tongue that checks the internet out for things that are particularly interesting, and then sifts it down. And so you'll have the 5 best long reads. I was talking earlier about the decline of that long, nourishing form of journalism that's so vital. And I love a site like Longreads for that reason, because I think it actually distills down particularly meaty pieces and presents them to you in a very condensed way. So I think that the internet actually presents loads of opportunities to not necessarily to lose that sense of quality, but to hone down. And the immediacy with which people can respond to something actually makes that conversation much quicker and much more. At the moment, I'm really enjoying and finding interesting the furore surrounding James Lasden's memoir coming out, which, if you haven't read, basically he was a workshop professor and he was stalked very aggressively by a student. And it's creating this extraordinary snowball of dialogue and comments pages and in places like on the Guardian site and on Twitter certainly. And I think that kind of conversation about whether do we call this a memoir, and how much of this is a sort of fictional posing in a way, and how much of it is how do we feel sorry for him as he's taking control of his life. That conversation's happening so much quicker and more democratically than it might have done previously. So. Okay,
thank you.
Sorry, Karina, can I just interject on that one?
Very quickly. Very quickly.
I wonder whether there is a converse to that, though. I mean, we've seen with the failure of Amazon lately that obviously the music industry has been in terrible trouble with physical shops, people moving away from physical products. But in the wake of that, there was an interesting story reported the other day that the sale of physical albums in the first quarter of first couple of months of this year has actually gone up considerably, because people have suddenly thought, God, if we don't support our local record shop, actually there's going to be nowhere left with that curatorial role. And I think people are working up to this idea that the curatorial role, dialogue with real people who can give them real advice about stuff that they might value, is I think it's happening slowly. And I think it might might take the publishing world a bit more time to wake up to that. But I think that's certainly there out in the high street, as it were.
Okay, thank you. Shelby.
Quickly, why revise? At what point do you stop revising? And I guess this is sort of the contrast to yours first.
Okay, I'd like to go to Tony with this one, because as a copywriter, he, even more than poetry, I think, it has to be revised and precise. And
Certainly does, and if you don't do it, there are a lot of people who do it for you, whether you want it or not. Several times you have to shove your piece of copy up many, many layers. I once counted, for Procter & Gamble, 11 different layers, all of whom, or 10 of whom, could say no or perhaps, and only the top one could say yes. Consequently, you tended to get built in a fail-safe mechanism. It was easier to say no or perhaps, and they couldn't say yes, so they tended to say, if we'll just make these few changes, we'll shove it up the ladder. We called it being nibbled to death by ducks. Nothing killed you, but eventually you became recognizable. So I thought, particularly with press copy, I would make it as watertight as it possibly could be, partly for my own satisfaction. And at that time, before cut and paste came in, I would write a piece of copy maybe 20 times, and I'd have it round the wall, pinned with a pin, and I could trace it round and trace it round. And it was amazing how the things you loved didn't have to be murdered, historically people say, but they just dropped away. In the end, you were left with the absolute austere minimum. And that's very important in advertising, because each word is paid for. It isn't there for anybody's delectation. The client pays for it, and he wants to see it there.
okay, thank you. So our last question is from Lizzie Scott Bowman.
It's a bit more of a light-hearted one about current taste. Why is everyone reading literary biography and vampire fiction?
Okay, I think if we just hear from everyone very briefly about how they would characterise 21st century taste.
I have absolutely no idea. Most of what I read tends to be 30, 40 years old. I mean, I read a lot of American beat generation stuff. I'm not qualified to answer that.
I suppose because I've got one child born in the 70s, one in the 80s and one in the 90s, I've been at the forefront of what the generation that I thought I'd left behind when I left here have been reading for rather a long time. So I have to confess to having just finished the 7,000th word of George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. I'm waiting for the next two to come out. I wouldn't say it's literary, I wouldn't say it's taste, but it certainly kept me occupied for a few minutes.
Okay. Ted?
I think when it comes to things like Twilight and Shades of Grey, and I think it's something to do with once the subconscious has been sanctioned, it's okay to read those things, then suddenly everyone reads them. I was on holiday recently, and there was a row of sun loungers, and it was literally 50 Shades of Grey all the way down, and there were all 50 shades of burgundy. You know, they didn't seem to care that they were just being burnt to a crisp. And I remember a boyfriend came over and said, "Do you want to go for a swim?" She was like, "Absolutely not, no way." And I don't know. I think that's kind of terrifying in its own way. I try not to think too much about what that's doing to what that means for me as someone who cares about poetry. But I don't know. I mean, I think that the taste at this point in time, it's such a strange thing, because that's the majority probably. But I also think, to put a positive spin on it, I do think that there is an enormous amount of fantastic work that is being written at the moment. One of the things that I was thinking about when preparing for this, if this is the closing thing, was Don Patterson has a poem of "Why Do You Stay Up So Late?" It's a poem, it's a beautiful poem, and he wrote it to his sons because they said, "Why do you bother staying up all night?" And they play computer games till whenever, and what's he doing in there? And he says, "You remember that time," I'm paraphrasing because it's a beautiful poem, but remember that time when you were looking in the rock pool and you were playing the jeweller with the rocks, and you saw that in the rock there was that secret brightness in that rock, and you're placing them outside. They're just dark stones, and when the sun who's arranged them in a particular way has kind of created a castle with them, and he says it's very much the same with his work. And when that stone goes bright, I think it says when he finds a mirror for his eye in it. So I think there's work like that which I think will last and be read for generations as well as 50 Shades of Grey.
Very
Quickly, I think the internet culture that we now inhabit is creating a weird sort of monoculture in a way. So 50 Shades of Grey becomes this sensation. Everyone is reading it. So it's this kind of feast or famine. It seems like everyone is reading one thing, and all the other books are kind of not being bought. So I think that we're getting this weird monoculture, which is unhealthy. I think also in terms of the vampire series and 50 Shades of Grey, they seem like they're all about sex, right? But I think it's actually about a turn to a more conservative culture, because the vampire series is all about virginity and keeping it, and 50 Shades of Grey is all about romantic fatalism and winning your man. So not what it seems. Claire?
I think that this question and some of the other things we've been talking about, for instance, about online publishing and copyright, and kind of taste as a thing that is out there rather than within us as well. I think that all kind of relates back to Amy's question, certainly from the point of view of the novel, about has innovation been exhausted? No, it hasn't. I mean, looking back at, for instance, the Renaissance, there was, as far as I know, no copyright then, and in the history of the book there have been vast convulsions, of which this is surely one of the most significant. And when we should fight, we should be fighting on the page. We should be fighting to make what we write, not how it is published or how it is consumed out there, the most important part of this revolution. And I don't think we can separate the two.
Okay, thank you. What?
Contemporary taste is a very difficult question. I could say something elaborate and complicated about aesthetics and negative dialectics and so on, but I'd just like to quote Beckett, really, which is what I do when I and Beckett, of course, puts it beautifully. He says simply, people are bloody ignorant apes.
When I left here, I went to KCL to do an MPhil in life writing, and my tutor for my dissertation was the late, great David Noakes, and he had written many 2-volume biographies, and they're very wonderful. But he complained to me in our first tutorial together that he couldn't find a publisher anymore for long literary biographies, because they were interested in celebrity biographies. So I would have to say celebrity seems to be the inexplicable non-celebrity life that we are forced to inhabit sometimes.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to say that, vampires are really 2008, and the thing now is mermaids. I spend a lot of my working week dealing with mermaid propositions. Okay, thank you so much to the panel. I think this discussion will go on over lunch and throughout the afternoon. I'd just like you all to give them a round of applause. Thank you.